And welcome everybody. Wonderful to see so many people. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being part of our event. Oh, as Anita mentioned, this is being recorded, so it will be possible to watch it back on our Facebook page after the event. So the reason that we are exploring this topic is because it is very common for people in a work scenario to be expected or encouraged to fly for certain things. So, and that can be quite difficult to disrupt that narrative. But we are showcasing some people who are disrupting that narrative. We're going to look at some of the practical aspects to not flying, how to travel by other means, what to do if you are expected to fly at work, how to put those policies in place to enable alternative travel, and what you do when your work is. each time you do that, Sunita, it mutes me as well, so I'll have to keep going. And how we can have international work without flying. It's a topic that we have explored in the past. It's very interesting to look at that world of work. Overall, though, so when we talk about kind of the reasons people fly, overall, the majority of flights are for leisure, they're for holidays. It's actually quite a small percentage of flights that are for work reasons, but changing the way we travel for work can have a huge impact on the culture, and especially if it's something we often don't feel that we can perhaps raise it at work, but when we do, that's something that will then that could then change company policy. So your ripple effect when you are talking in a work context in terms of how you travel can be very powerful. So that's some of the stuff we're going to explore this evening as well. So I'll just introduce you to everyone who is on our panel this evening. And as Sunita mentioned, if you do want to have kind of the panelists' view, so rather than look at everybody in the meeting, you can select speaker view, which will show you just the person who's speaking. So that might be a nice way for you to experience the event. Yes. So after I've just done this introduction, we will then be having our panel session, so several questions to our panelists, and then after that there'll be a chance for you to ask your questions, so please do put them in the chat. That will be monitored throughout, and hopefully we'll get around to your question by the end. So firstly, can I introduce Jonathan Emmett? So you are from Nottingham, I know, Jonathan, and a children's author. So do you want to introduce yourself, Jonathan, just 30 seconds or so, where you're from? Oh, Nottingham, I gave it away already. And what you do, what is your job?
Yep, so I'm a children's author, mostly picture books, and part of the job for most children's authors these days is promoting yourself. Usually going into schools in the UK, but also occasionally to go abroad for events, and even to go and visit schools abroad. So that's really where it impacts on my sort of day-to-day work.
Thank you. Okay, and thanks for joining us. Okay, so next up, I'll introduce Lois. So Lois, you're based in Manchester, I believe, at the Tyndall Centre. So can you give a bit of an introduction to you and the kind of work that you do up in Manchester, please?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm a final year PhD researcher at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research, which is a interdisciplinary research group at the University of Manchester. And my research specifically looked at the waste impact of the aviation sector and quantifying the environmental impact of all of this rubbish that is generated on flights. So tangentially related to flying and the aviation impact.
Thank you, Lois. Great to have you. Should we move on to Rebecca next? Because you are also based in university in Lancaster. So would you like to please introduce yourself to everybody and say what you do?
Sure. So I'm Rebecca Willis. I'm a professor of energy and climate governance at Lancaster University. My research looks at the relationship between people and government, basically. So what people expect of government on climate and what government expects or should expect of people. So I've also been quite involved in discussions in Lancaster, both at university level and at department level, about how we manage our own climate impact. And yeah, I can tell you some of the highs and lows of that, Anna.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Okay, so next up, Charlotte. So Charlotte, you're based in public health in London, I believe. So yeah, can you introduce yourself, please, and tell us what you do?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. My name's Charlotte Baker, and yeah, I live in southwest London, and until very recently was working for the UN in Geneva in global health. And travelling back and forth every 6 weeks to 2 months between London and Geneva.
Thank you. And I know you're really active on Twitter, sharing your experiences and hopefully inspiring lots of other people to travel overland, especially within Europe. So thank you. Thanks for your inspiration. Okay, Paul next. So Paul is a geography teacher. Do you want to introduce yourself, Paul, where you're from, and a little outline of your work?
Yeah, so I'm down sort of on the south coast of England. I sort of was a geography teacher for the last sort of 15 years, and actually in the last couple of years I've got involved a bit more in climate education and sort of curriculum authoring, and I'm currently working on a project funded by Ecotricity called the Ministry of Eco Education, where we're sort of supporting schools to teach more sustainability. But yeah, through my kind of networks and teaching, there's obviously been a lot of engagement with organising trips and sort of trying to come up with more creative ways to be able to do that and not just rely on the traditional flying.
Brilliant. Thank you. Really looking forward to hearing what you have to say about that, Paul. So thanks very much. And finally, Sandy. So Sandy, you work in emergency medicine. What's your job about, and where are you from?
Hi everyone, so my name is Sandy Robertson. I'm an emergency medicine doctor. I'm about 9 months away from getting to the level of being a consultant if I pass my next exams. I also work for the Royal College of Emergency Medicine, looking at how to make that itself more environmentally sustainable and how we can practice in a more environmentally sustainable way. And it's that part of my work which means I have to come to meetings in London, which was easy when I lived in London, a bit more difficult when I live up in Edinburgh. But I've also travelled for international conferences talking about sustainability in emergency medicine to Berlin. I've got one coming to Amsterdam, I even got the ferry over to Belfast. So that's what I can share my experiences of.
Brilliant. And we're going to start with that actually, Sandy. So we'll stay with you because the first topic we want to explore is about that question of conferences. So that seems to be a major part of lots of professions, having those conferences. We have that kind of conversation, that question, meeting in real life, having those water cooler conversations. Obviously, during COVID, we got used to meeting virtually, but there is so much to be said for being in the room with someone. But you have been able to do that, Sandy, without flying. So can you tell us a bit more about those conferences then that you travel to?
Yeah, so I suppose the most exciting one was in Berlin. It was the European Society of Emergency Medicine, and I was speaking on environmental sustainability. And we've not flown as a family since 2019, end of 2018, and it was half term, so the kids came with us as well. So it was a mammoth journey all the way from Edinburgh down to Paris, and then along to Berlin, which was really fun. The things that made it a bit tricky was I wasn't able to be at the conference as many days as if I had flown, because it took one extra day to go there. But I was lucky enough that my supervisors allowed me to use my study leave we're allowed to use it for transport or and travel. And I think actually working up in Scotland, they know that people will maybe fly or train, and they're used to using that study leave rather from just the day that you're there on a conference to actually the travel as well. And they didn't seem to have a problem using kind of more days. We're lucky in medicine that we often have more days of study leave than we do of budget, so they don't really mind if we take an extra day of study leave if they don't have to pay anything for it. And in emergency medicine, I am also quite lucky that my career progression doesn't depend on publishing at an international level. we are mostly able to get consultant jobs without having to do that. There are parts of the healthcare profession which are very competitive to get jobs and progress, where you have to travel around the world. So I haven't and present at international conferences, so I haven't had to have that experience yet. I'm due to speak in Amsterdam coming soon, and that's meant a lot of rearranging of night shifts and things to try and get the time at either end. And it'll end up with me kind of traveling for 24 hours, having a rest at home, and then going straight into the night shift. But it is manageable. The next conference I'm going to, the one in Amsterdam, is the International Committee of Emergency Medicine, and I wasn't sure I was going to go, but then they're doing a little bit more in the sustainability work, and I realized that actually it might be somewhere around the world next year and the years after, because it's an international conference. And so it's really made me make the decision to go this year, because I'm not sure when it'll be back in Europe, and I do plan to just say no, I'll just turn up virtually if it's somewhere that I can get to easily enough. So that's about it.
Yeah, okay. And so typically I imagine most other people will fly to these conferences.
Yes, yeah. It was interesting talking to my colleagues. They all flew to Berlin. One person who's on my environmental specialist interest group with me also got the train. So we were the two flying less people. I think actually she got the train one way and flew back the other way. There was a lot of slightly uncomfortable interactions with people when they, kind of that I said, I flew, I took the train because I don't fly, and then people immediately felt like they needed to justify why they were flying, which I'm sure all of you get as well. And it's that funny kind of shuffle, being like, it's fine, it's everyone's own decisions, this is what makes me happy, I'm not judging you, please still be my friend. But so there's a bit of that, but I think it got people talking and seeing that it was possible.
Yeah, that's important. Charlotte, I just noticed you nodding your head quite enthusiastically there. Should we come to you, because you have regular experience of traveling by train where possibly other people are flying? Is that your experience?
Yeah, no, I just identify with that so well, because when I talk to colleagues about how I get to Geneva in this particular case, and I say that I'm going to the train station, they always say, have a safe flight home, or what time do you need to leave for the airport, or always, those are the questions. I said, actually, no, train station and a safe train journey home. And they're all like, you come all the way here by train from London? Is either one kind of reaction, they look at you like you're slightly crazy. And then the other reaction is when I follow that up by saying I don't fly short haul, basically, then they sort of go, oh, right. And then exactly what was just described, which is that they sort of feel the need to justify their own short haul flying, in some cases very short haul, indeed. And it's quite difficult. That being said, the flip side of it is that if you get into conversations with open-minded people, it's actually really interesting. I've got someone who worked for me who we were having dinner last week, and because I'm leaving the job, I won't be doing the journey as much. And she was sort of asking about the journey and the cost and all of these details, which we can get into a bit, maybe perhaps later. But I was just saying to her that, I feel it's not just about the climate impact, actually, but it's about the huge benefits for me of train travel. There's a lot to be said. If you look at some of my Twitter threads, the slow travel kind of element of it for me, I find really good for my physical and mental well-being and my productivity. I get so much more done by sitting on a train for 5 hours going to Geneva than if I was working my way through an airport. And airports these days are pretty hellish experiences. I think the Eurostar and the TGV by comparison really aren't. And so we were chatting all this, and then 2 days later she WhatsApped me and said, okay, I'm doing it. I've booked my Eurostar and TGV to London in July. And I was like, oh my God, that's brilliant. I said, and she said, it wasn't that expensive as I thought. I've done it really in advance. And she, like me, has family in London and does the reverse journey a lot. So I do think that there's an entry point as well to you being able to engage with your colleagues on this topic and kind of have a chat and explain. If you can sort of get past that initial thing where people feel terribly guilty when they hear that and people have also commented on my Twitter threads calling me a smug woke snowflake and all of this stuff, which if you like me, you're a bit of a sort of general environmental campaigner, is kind of water off a duck's back. But I do think that actually having those conversations with people is really important. And I think there's 5 or 6 people in my life now who have taken the train to Europe rather than flying, because they've heard from me about how actually quite straightforward it is. And those are really important conversations. And in a working context, they're kind of even more important, really, particularly when you work in global health like I do, because the climate impact of all the travel we do is just horrendous, really. Anything that can be done to minimize it is really important.
Yeah, thank you for that, Charlotte. And yeah, so for you and Sandy as well, do you find that your colleagues, you've just said this, Charlotte, that your colleagues are influenced? I think that's something that we can all remember. All of our actions do have an impact on other people, even if it's not immediate. That conversation that you've had about, the awkward kind of, oh, sorry for flying sort of thing, that does feed into future behaviour. It does seep in, and that's really important, especially in that work context, isn't it? Okay, so one more question for you and for Sandy. It's about the support that your company would give you. So as you've kind of hinted at, Charlotte, about the cost, I don't know if Sandy, you found the same, the cost is higher. Is your company happy to pay that cost? Do you have to have awkward conversations? Did you have to push for it? How did that come about in the first place? Charlotte, do you want to answer that first, and then we'll come to Sandy?
Yeah, for me, it was actually quite straightforward. It was the nature of my contract changed over the time I was in this job. So for the first half, that work were funding the travel, and for the second half, I was funding the travel. But when work were funding the travel, it was buried in the travel policy that trains were fine, basically. And the policy was basically, as long as you didn't exceed the overall budget that was laid out for your trip, then it was perfectly reasonable to do so. And so it was just a normal travel request that we put through the system as usual, and it was approved. And I was really surprised, and then sort of followed up and said, why aren't we doing more to talk to colleagues about this? Because there was a big conference in Berlin that lots of people went to from my organization, and I think about 50 people flew or something like that. And actually Geneva to Berlin by train, there's a night train from Zurich, it's quite doable. But I think it was a lack of kind of awareness and that sort of thing. And also, maybe at some point when everyone's traveling en masse, cost probably does factor in a little bit. But in terms of the policy, it was quite straightforward. And then obviously, since I've been funding the journeys myself, yeah, I will admit, sometimes, not always, but sometimes it has been more expensive to go by train. The way I see that is that, maybe I just won't go out for dinner once that week when I'm out visiting colleagues, or we make choices and trade-offs all the time in our lives about lots of different things. And the thing I really struggle with in general about flying versus taking trains and people's comments about the cost is that, it's choices, isn't it, about how you spend your money. And maybe the overarching climate imperative means that maybe you take one foreign holiday a year rather than the two that you'd like to take, and you just make that one a journey by train, for example. And I think we need to be more honest about the trade-offs that are involved. But yeah, work very supportive, and it was pretty easy, and I was fortunate, really
good point. Thank you, Charlotte. And yeah, I'd just like to kind of emphasize that often these things are part of a policy, even if they're buried, and you just have to have the nous to ask, and you might be surprised at the answer. So yeah, well done. Okay, Sandy, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, so as a 37-year-old still junior doctor, I have £450 study budget and travel budget a year. So it's never going to cover the whole of anything that I want. So I knew that things would be coming out of my costs. The conference in Berlin, I was lucky enough to apply and get an award to have them pay for transport and a bit of accommodation, and that was up to €350, and that actually paid for my 4-day URail or Interrail pass. So you could use that money however you wanted. So that was fine. And for the cost, I think once you get into Interrail passes and things like that, especially if you're traveling from Scotland, there's always the extra cost of having to get somewhere. Not everywhere. You can't fly everywhere from Edinburgh or Glasgow. You might have to stop off somewhere or get a train somewhere. So actually, by the time you factor that in, the costs of flying direct from Scotland and trains with an Interrail pass isn't too much different from what I've been able to tell so far. You have to be quite creative with the days that you go and make sure you get back up all in one day. But it's you know, it's cheaper than just a Eurostar return sometimes on its own to get into Railpass. So that's the way that I've got around it. I wish we had a bigger study budget, but NHS unfortunately isn't there.
Brilliant. Okay. So on this topic, let's come to Rebecca and Lois. So talking about travel policies, I know, Lois, at the Tyndall Centre, there's a very forward-thinking travel policy that, Rebecca, you were referencing earlier on Twitter. I noticed you were talking about this. And in fact, I quite liked your question that you asked on Twitter. Why is lots of flying the default approach in academia? So let's dig into that a little bit, but starting off by talking about that policy. So Lois, would you like to outline the travel policy that exists at the Tyndall Centre?
Yeah, of course. So the work was all done a bit before I joined the Tyndall Centre, but our director, Carly McLaughlin, as well as some of the other people who are academics who work in the Tyndall Centre and members of the sustainability team at the University of Manchester, have essentially developed a decision tree, which is aimed to help academics and members of the university decide if flying is a necessary part of traveling to an event they might be going to. So it asks you questions about, do you need to be there physically? Is there a way you can take part virtually? If you have to be there physically, is it possible for you to get a train, to get a ferry? And I, as part of this as well, the university's made a commitment to reduce its emissions from travel. So sort of speaking a bit to the point that Sandy made earlier, PhD budgets often don't stretch very far either. So I'm going to 2 international conferences this year, one in Dublin and one in Bologna, taking the train and the ferry to both. But if I had had to pay for the train to Bologna out of my own PhD budget, it would have covered the journey and no accommodation, none of the fees to take part, no food while I was there. So I'm quite lucky that the university have got a top-up fund for low carbon travel. So essentially they will pay the difference between what the cost of a flight would have been, which I think when I was looking for Bologna, it was about £80. And it's costing me about 900, including like accommodation on the way to go there and back. So I'm very lucky that the low carbon travel fund is like supporting that. And the Tyndall Centre in generally the expectation is you don't fly when you go to these kind of, especially like European conferences. So it's a good environment to be making those decisions within as well. Very supportive.
Brilliant. That's so forward thinking, isn't it? That the default is you don't fly. Yeah, wonderful. And so Rebecca, have you kind of built on that? Because you said you kind of nicked that travel policy for your own department. Is that right?
Yeah, so my department is Lancaster Environment Centre. So mostly environmental scientists, some of whom work on climate, but most don't. I'm one of the few social scientists in that department, and we have a very active sustainability group, and we decided that the thing we were going to bite off and deal with was air travel. If you look at the university's carbon footprint overall, then travel is the big ticket item in terms of carbon footprint. The university now has quite strong targets to be net zero between 2030 and 2035, depending on what scope you're using to measure that carbon footprint. And so coming to terms with flying is a really significant part of that. I have to say, I mean, the uni as a whole is only at the very start of the process. So within my department, we just nicked the Tyndall Centre's travel tree because I think the most important thing is to just get people to start thinking really systematically about whether they need to fly. Do they actually need to, cross the Atlantic for the sake of a 2-day conference? Could they instead do a 6-month visiting fellowship in whatever university or whatever research group they want to be part of in the US? Obviously taking the train instead of the plane for short haul, what can be done online instead. There's a lot of different ways of approaching this, and the great thing about the Tyndall Centre thing is it sort of you know, it's a nice flow chart. You just work through it in a very logical way. And ideally, what I would want to see in my department, I'd be interested to know whether this happens in Tyndall, is that, you know, when you get sign off for your expenses, they say, how did you work through the travel tree, the decision tree? Did you actually consider whether you could have done X, Y, or Z instead of flying? I don't think that happens. It happens if, you know, it'll happen to everyone in whose budgets I oversee, that's for sure. But, you know, flying is still the default in academia, especially for sciences, because it's, you know, it's an international cohort that you're working with. So it just is the default. And there's very little thought goes into alternatives. I have trained myself to raise it every single time this is discussed. So someone says, oh, I'm off to, you know, I'm off to, I don't know, you know, California for a conference. I'm like, okay, you know, I'm interested to know, you know, posting it as curiosity. I'm interested to know whether you considered X, Y, or Z, or how did you find the travel tree, or that kind of thing. And you know, and I force myself to raise it, but it's really hard because it makes you feel like a freak.
Wow. Yeah.
So I think it's, you know, it's a lot to do with sort of cultural norms. And so I maybe I disagree a little bit with this thing about, I think Sandy, you said, oh, don't worry, it's your own choice. But I sort of feel like we should be challenging that a little bit, actually. I think that we should be getting to the position where people should be considering alternatives, and they should absolutely be within their rights to fly if they, you know, if they've exhausted all other options, or if they've got caring responsibilities, which means they can't afford that extra day's travel or whatever it might be. But they're the ones who should be having to justify themselves.
That is such a powerful point, actually, Rebecca. I think, yeah, we can't just pussyfoot around this, can we? This is serious. It would be very interesting for maybe all of the panelists to, towards the end, maybe give their kind of tips for how to have those conversations, because those are the most awkward ones. I like what you've said already, Rebecca, about saying, you know, is it have you considered, or how did that work with the travel tree kind of thing. It's helpful to have those parameters within which to start those conversations, because they are really awkward. And as you said, you have to force yourself to do it. Even at Flight for UK, when we do this all the time, it's still horrible to have those conversations, and often I personally shy away from them. You know, it's really hard. So yeah, let's see if we can finish the panel session with a little tip from each of you about how to start those conversations, or something that doesn't make people feel attacked, but that will make them really think seriously about this and how serious it is. Thank you, Becca, that was great. So Paul, I noticed you nodding your head when we were talking about the culture, and that's something I would like to explore now with relation to what you're doing. So the cultural aspect of this is so hard in all of our professions. Flying does come with the territory a bit. So how have you, as a geography teacher, you have been expected to do in like field trips that are abroad, or sorry.
Well, I think with the societal piece, that schools, you know, with impressionable young children, that's an opportunity there, particularly also where schools are placed within the wider community, an opportunity to sort of challenge some of those societal norms in terms of how we travel. Because a lot of what I was thinking about as well was that sense that you come back from a holiday and the conversation is, you know, what did you do, where did you go, and there's an expectation of sort of saying, oh, you know, where did you go on holiday, and did you fly, and those sorts of things. And I think there's a way that teachers can ask questions and challenge. I think Rebecca was sort of really referencing that, in that sense of just challenging people's sort of behaviours and expectations. And I think schools are a very good place for that. The thing that also makes me feel very uncomfortable is that sense of teachers setting a norm, and the idea that as a school, there are many schools, I think this really is the norm. There's an expectation that subjects organise international trips, And I think some of that comes from a sense of competition. There's this sort of capitalism is driven within schools, competition between schools, competition between subjects as well, where there's competition for the numbers of students. And schools will often try and outdo each other on their trips. And often that means trying to go to the most outlandish, most sort of exotic location possible, without necessarily thinking about the learning opportunities. And what I would say is there are lots of geography teachers I know of who actively choose to organise trips within the UK. And there are schools, there's a school I previously worked in where there was a blanket no flying policy. And the thing that really chimes with me as well is that sense that one of the easiest ways to make this happen that I've seen is also putting it in policy, putting it in documents so that it becomes the norm in the planning. So again, maybe following some sort of decision-making process where you think, well, actually, is there an alternative? Is there somewhere else we could do this trip? Is there another way we could do this? What I would also say from a school's perspective is there's a whole sort of travel business around getting schools to do these sorts of trips. And I think there's a responsibility from those sorts of organizations to do more. At the moment, lots of it is, from my perspective, quite sort of superficial. There still is a lot of discussion around offsetting. I have heard, there's a previous school I worked in where we sort of tried, we were encouraged to organise a trip to Iceland. There was an expectation of it. And so in order to feel happy about doing that, we thought, okay, well, can we calculate the carbon that's going to be emitted with this trip? And we were taking 30 students and we thought, okay, well, roughly it's about 60 trees that we would need to see to their full life. And rather than just paying a company to offset that and not really understanding and knowing what might happen to that, we thought, well, actually, can we use some of the school site to plant trees and then put a plaque that would stay there indefinitely that would say these trees are associated with this trip. And so we tried to use that as a learning opportunity. And again, kind of appreciate that there's flaws in all of that. But again, it's just getting people to think about this. And I think with young children, that's a really fundamental important thing to do.
Yeah, very important. I like that school that had a blanket no-fly policy. That's really revolutionary. How could we encourage other schools to do the same? Do you think that's possible?
Yeah, so I'm part of the UK Schools Sustainability Network, and there's definitely momentum around that. What is interesting is it's often sort of lone teachers who are trying to drive this, and lots of the barriers come from senior management who feel that there's necessity for these sorts of trips. I think the more that we can show there are alternatives where you either organise trips within the UK or you look to see how you can travel by ground. I think the more examples that are shared, the better.
Yeah, and so obviously you did organise that trip to Iceland. Have there been other instances when you've been asked to organise something and you've said, actually, no, let's do this in the UK, let's do this by coach, whatever? How have you gone about that?
Yeah, so I think I was also organising the Duke of Edinburgh's award. It was that sort of stereotype of a geography teacher also doing DofE. We used the overnight train up to Scotland to do a gold DofE expedition and incorporated that into the experience of the trip. So it was again saying, look, actually, by not flying, you're going to have a much better experience. It's going to be such an exciting opportunity, so many more learning opportunities. And that was sort of how we sold it. It was more expensive than if we were to fly up to Scotland, and it did add an additional day to the trip, but it was sort of seen overall as a benefit. The thing that I also think is interesting that I'm really keen to maybe talk about a bit more as well is that sense that young people in particular are really conscious of the impact of the climate and nature crisis, and the idea that you might take a field trip to somewhere like Iceland and stand on a glacier and say, look at the retreat and look how far it's gone back, whilst having flown to go and do that the mental sort of gymnastics and the sort of blocking out of that, and I think that can have a really negative impact on young people and sort of sit with them for the rest of their life. And I know we can have parallels in terms of food and the way we travel kind of more broadly as well, that sits like that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if people might be interested in one of the posts that we have on our website, which is called Learning to Fly. And it's about this very topic, school trips by air, and how valid they are or valuable, or what they actually teach us. And the examples are the main thing that a school trip by air will teach children is how to fly, or that flying is normal. And actually, the learning experiences, and probably you found this, Paul, to have you can learn just as much from a trip that doesn't involve air travel in the UK or in the nearby countries in Europe. Even distant countries in Europe are still possible by coach. So doing that, and then the other things that those trips teach us and how they shape our children's lives, it is through the relationships with your friends, the relationships with your teachers. Those are things that can happen anywhere. So, really pushing back against that narrative, I think, is very important.
Yeah, and also I think that one of the responses that's often the rebuttal is to say you're denying these children the opportunity. And you think, how privileged are you to have that sort of mentality to say, we should allow these children to do it because they can do it. The majority of people don't have access to these sorts of opportunities. And again, what a norm are you setting to say that, yes, it's perfectly fine for you to fly because you have the choice and the ability to do that. And what you're not then educating young people to understand is actually how that isn't an opportunity and a choice for the majority, even in the UK compared to the rest of the world.
That's such a good point. Yes, of course, a trip to Iceland must be it will exclude lots of people because they simply won't be able to afford it. So not just bad for the climate, but also bad for equality. Okay, thank you, Paul. Great stuff there. So let's think, finally, we're going to come to you, Jonathan, and think about when there are those examples of international events that you are going to attend that couldn't be done by train or other means, and how we do that. So I know that you speak to school groups worldwide by video link. So do you want to tell us a bit more about that aspect of your work?
Yes, I mean, I stopped flying in 2005, and actually while my kids were still little, and what Paul was saying about school trips, I kind of seen that from the parents' perspective, possibly something we talk about a little bit later, but stopped flying in 2005. And initially I thought, like a lot of people, I'm just going to do this for leisure. But once you've made that decision to do it for leisure, you find yourself thinking, can I really justify doing this for work? And from my point of view, as a picture book author, getting a picture book published these days, it's not good enough just to get a UK publisher. You need to get foreign co-editions, and the biggest co-edition market for English language writers like myself is the US. And so I had to think about, how do I keep engaged with readers in the US? And I was quite fortunate because at the time at which I started, or more or less a couple of years after making that decision not to fly, I was contacted by a school in the US. And it was quite strange because I was contacted by two students, which made me feel uncomfortable, saying, will you Skype with us? And I said, well, if you get your librarian to ask me, I will Skype you. I'll visit your class virtually. And I soon learned that there was a really established culture of virtual visiting authors within the US. I got my name on a couple of directories over there, and I was able to very quickly probably build a stronger relationship with my US readership than at that time I had with my UK readership, which was quite ironic because there was a lot of demand. I was initially doing stuff for free. I was getting usually 2 US schools a week. I offered 2 free slots a week, and I was doing 2 free schools. There was nothing like that in the UK at the time, and there was a lot of prejudices against virtual visits in the UK. And so one of the things that I did to try and kickstart that culture over here was I set up a site called Virtual Authors UK, which was a directory site just so that UK schools in particular could find authors wherever they were that were published in the UK that would virtually visit with them. So I was really sort of paying back the favor that the people that had set up the 2 US sites had done me by sort of plugging me into their kids over there. So yes, that's one of the sort of satisfying things about doing what I've done, and certainly back then, but even today, I can remember back then I would be talking to a class in the US, and they would be introduced to me that I was in the UK. And in those days, I used to get a globe, and I'd show them where I was and show them where they were, and say, it's morning where you are, but it's afternoon where I am. And kids at the back of the class would just go, "This is so cool." You'd hear them sort of shouting it out. And it's exactly the sort of thing, when I was a kid, that I sort of fantasized about being able to do. So I've very sort of quickly learned that, that although it's not the same as being there in person, there are things that you can do on a virtual visit that you can't do on an in-person visit. And one of the things is you can see where I work. And often in an in-person visit, somebody will ask me a question about, do you write non-fiction as well as fiction or something like that? And I won't have a thing with me to show them. And I think, I wish I'd bought that, because that would have really answered that question well. Whereas if I'm on a virtual visit, I can do that. I can take the thing off the bookshelf. If I wanted to, I could walk around the house. And, in many ways, there are a lot of benefits to it, and there's also a lot of benefits to sort of in-person visits as well, but the two kind of complement each other very well.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you, Jonathan. Okay, we've got a couple more minutes now of this first session, after which we will take questions from our attendees, our audience. So please be thinking of your questions and put them in the chat box if you haven't already. But shall we just finish off with one more point? I know I did ask you if you could have that kind of tip for starting those conversations, but also other aspects of this. So how do we say no to work commitments that might involve a flight? How do we persuade our employer to allow travel by other means? But I think we kind of covered that in the first couple of questions with Sandy and Charlotte anyway. But if something has kind of popped into your heads as we've been doing this initial session, now's the time to share it. I think, one thing I want to just raise as well before we carry on is something that struck me when Rebecca, I think you were talking about those trips abroad to conferences, etc. Something that we're often asked to comment when a high profile person gets on a plane to go and talk at a climate conference, which seems to be the kind of height of irony, really. And one of them was Sadiq Khan going to Buenos Aires to talk at a climate conference. There are other famous examples, but something that we try to illustrate is, yes, it's very impactful to go somewhere and give a talk. And these conferences, especially people with a high profile, these conferences are important. However, how big would the impact have been if that person would have appeared by video link and said why? I'm not flying to this conference, to Brazil or wherever it is, Argentina, sorry, because of the climate crisis. And here is my presentation. And that is what's going to remain with people. That would be the takeaway. Rebecca, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, thank you. So actually, one of my colleagues, Steve Westlake, who you might know, Anna, has actually done research on whether leaders adopting sustainability behaviour influence others. And the short answer is yes, they really do. So if prominent people, not just flying to climate conferences, but anyone, we've seen it a little bit now in the world of sports, haven't we? People saying that they won't fly to get to a particular sporting event. That really makes people think, because if someone if someone you admire is making that decision, then you will sit up and think. So that's his answer. But so Steve found that when he said to people exactly what you said, Anna, that, imagine how impactful it would be if Sadiq Khan said, I don't want to fly for climate reasons. And the reasons people give for not doing that is that they don't want to be sort of seen as holier than thou, or they don't want to sort of set up unreasonable expectations. And so what that's partly an excuse, isn't it? But I think there is a grain of truth in that. And so one thing I'm quite keen to get away from is maybe this is a challenge for flight free, but I'm keen not to see it as black and white. If someone who was crossing the Atlantic 12 times a year gets that down to 6, then that's amazing, right? And so, a really good friend of mine, Kate Rawls, who's a sort of climate philosopher and adventurer, brilliant combination. She's made her own rule that she flies she'll allow herself a flight every 3 years. And so she actually starts looking forward to it. She says, how shall I use my precious ration of a flight? But then she also, really thinks about all the places she can get to without flying. So I think the more we can break it down and say, look, this is really serious. We need, significant shifts in travel behavior, but it doesn't mean that you can never fly again. By the way, remember that most of the world never got on a plane.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
that surely is the message.
Yeah, thank you. We actually have a podcast interview with Kate Rawls on
brilliant.
Her cycle journey along the Andes that she went to by cargo ship across the Atlantic, which is just mind-blowing. So yeah, Charlotte, should we quickly come to you? You want to just make a point about incentives?
Yeah, I think just to say that I think that with all climate campaigning that involves behaviour change, I think you have got to sort of start on what's in it for the people who are going to change their behaviour. So I think for most people, we need to be honest and say that it's good for the planet is not enough to make them change their behaviour. A lot of people, including people in my own life, say to me not getting on that plane makes no difference. The plane's still going anyway, all of these arguments. And I have to say that I have some sympathy with that argument. Like, I understand how people arrive at that conclusion. So I also think it's about showing the benefits that you get from making the choice to either not fly or to fly to travel in a flight-free way. So what I try and do a lot on with my Twitter threads, etc., is to deconstruct for people what seems like quite an overwhelming process, actually. So I think that connecting to the continent by train, for example, feels to a lot of people like, oh my goodness me, how on earth do I do this? And even something, I have to tell you that changing trains between Gare du Nord and Gare de Lyon in Paris is not easy for the uninitiated. And I had to find I Googled a guide that I found somewhere that literally walked me to the right line on the metro, because the first time around, it was very stressful. I actually took a Brompton bike with me last time so that I could just cycle across Paris to avoid the metro. And so I do think that there's information that you can give people, and that's engagement. I do it on Twitter, but also with people personally, about actually, this is how you do it step by step. And then it's really plugging the great stuff about it, which is that for the Eurostar, you can show up 45 minutes ahead of time. Security and passport control, even post-Brexit, takes 15 minutes. And then you're sat there, and 15 minutes later, they call you to your train and you're getting on board. That is an amazing experience compared to flying. That is just not, you can't even compare an airport experience with that. And the Eurostar terminal in London is in the centre of London. It's not on some far-flung outskirts of London that you have to get to by coach or by train. And then on the continent, rail travel is just a superior experience. There's no way of putting it. Like travelling in some EasyJet plane versus going on a TGV or whatever, or the Frecciarossi I went on for the first time the other week, which is the new Italian trains. It's absolutely incredible. You sit there, you feel calm. On Friday night of last week, I was in the bar buffet car of the TGV Lyria from Geneva to Paris, and everyone was sat there having a drink with their friends or colleagues or co-travelers, or chatting to random people like I was. And we're all just sat there on a Friday night, socializing, enjoying the view. You cannot do that on an aeroplane. You're hemmed in next to people, and it just isn't possible to get up and walk around. People traveling with kids. Lots of trains on the continent have children's area they can run around in. Again, on a plane, you cannot do that. And so I think it's really important, and especially when traveling for work, just final point, and then I have to drop, so apologies. But I was planning to go to a conference in Berlin last year, and sadly our plans changed. And yes, it would have taken me, I have to say, the whole of my Sunday to get there on time for Monday of the conference. That's completely true. London to Berlin is still not that easy in terms of timing compared to, say, London to Geneva, which is quite straightforward. But then I thought about it a lot, and I was thinking, look, for this conference, I probably would have spent a working day sitting down with my papers and my notes, preparing for the sessions, preparing for the stuff I had to do. And so what I've done is just transfer the time that I would have sat in my office to the train. And so I think that's the other thing about work trips in particular, is that you can be incredibly productive. You literally are sat there and you have to do something. And I have just got so much work done, you know, but traveling by train. I think that's just something that people forget as well. So I just want to plug the really positive things. You don't have to, it doesn't have to be about the kind of climate conscience that not everybody has. It's also about extolling the virtues of this as something that's great for you as well, basically.
Thank you, Charlotte. Yeah, very well put there, and agree with all of that. Thanks. I know you have to go now, so thanks so much for contributing. And if anybody has any questions specifically for Charlotte, you can get in touch and we'll make sure they get to her. So thank you so much for joining us, Charlotte. Any other final points from our panelists before we go to questions? No one's jumping in. That's okay. That's fine. Jonathan,
actually,
go on.
I will say something.
I
was just going to say something to follow up on what Paul said, because when we decided to stop flying as a family for leisure, our kids, they're 5 years apart, but they were still at the age where, you know, there was an exchange trip with their school to go to Germany, and my son got a place on the Scout Jamboree in Sweden, and we made this decision that although we wouldn't holiday as a family together, we would let them go on school trips because of this peer pressure issue. But they're both now adults. And we did talk to them about why we didn't fly for our holidays. And what surprised me, my daughter in particular, because she's the younger of the two, is that she's completely come around now to not doing it. So even though she's still in touch with the exchange friend in Germany, it was in 2020 and it didn't happen in the end, but she planned to get there by rail, and she had other friends that were going by plane, and she went against the peer pressure. So, you know, just to those of you that, you know, perhaps be annoyed by the way that schools do, you know, encourage kids to get on a plane, if you can sort of hold a reasonable line at home, but, you know, give them a little bit of flexibility, they may come round to it. I just wanted to sort of say that, following on from what Paul said earlier.
Thank you. Okay, Sunita, I'll hand back to you now. If you can lead the question session, if there's lots of questions for our panelists, I'm sure there are.
Hi, yeah, sure. So there's a couple of questions in, so I'm just going to go in order. So we have one from Issy, who says, it's really obviously great to hear all the discussions about unis and departments who are thinking about flying less. Do you have any tips for getting the ball rolling, specifically to get the travel trees that were mentioned and moving away from the default flying at universities? Rebecca's already written something, so if anyone else wants to pop in their comment about that, specifically the travel trees. And sorry, I should actually put, they put especially as a PhD or someone with not great amounts of power within the institution.
Can I just
Would
say
anyone? Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as I said in my answer in the chat, well, universities are very alive to student feedback. That's definitely true, what with the fees being what they are. So actually student campaigns are a really good way of getting things done in unis. But I do think, I'm sure this is the same in other professions as well, but I do think that obviously the less, you know, the more junior you are, the harder it is to make a stand. And I think that puts more onus on, you know, those of us who are a bit longer in the tooth, to create that space for people coming up. And, you know, which is why, you know, basically the older you are, the more vocal you should be about it, I think, to allow other people to have that space. But I think we've done some brilliant stuff where, you know, senior and more junior staff have sort of worked together and done a bit of a pincer movement.
Okay, thank you. Would anyone else like to say anything on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I can, as a PhD, I guess I can come in. So I'm quite fortunate, like I say, in that the Tyndall Centre is generally very much supportive of the default is you don't fly. But you know, through conversations with people who don't work necessarily in the same research space as me, or in different like groups, and in general, even with people you don't work with your, you know, your peers, I feel like giving positive examples, you know, which refers a bit back to what Charlotte was saying, giving positive examples of these experiences is a way to start people talking about it and coming around to the idea of it. So, you know, questioning the idea in the first place of is flying necessary, and then providing these examples of times when you know, have either decided not to fly or have traveled in an alternative way. It brings people on board, and you know, they're quite often interested as well in asking like how are you doing that? How are you going to be going all the way to Italy in 2 days on trains and so on? And so I feel like that sort of through having those conversations, you will hopefully find people who have similar, you know, perspectives to yourself. And, you know, you mentioned in the chat about founding a flight-free group at your university. And there will be people, you know, who work at the institution who have a similar perspective to you. So through having those conversations, hopefully that's a good way to try and find them.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's just another question which I think is kind of asking the same thing, which is how do we make them enforce a no-fly travel policy as a beginner? And earlier on in the chat, it's a very engaged chat. Someone's mentioned sort of student groups being a way to sort of change things, which I think is quite good. But I'm just gonna, I think if no one else has anything to say on that, I can ask another question. Which I'm just trying to find. Just scroll down from it, but it's from Richard. And he says, to what extent is the huge cost difference between flying and surface travel an artificial construct? He gives the example because government policy and direct subsidies can affect that. There are a few answers written in the chat as well, so if anyone has anything to add, that would be great.
I mean,
Rebecca?
I can start. I mean, by artificial construct, yes, it is absolutely. I mean, you know, basically transport is you know, massively enabled or hindered by government decisions, government spending and taxation. So it would not be difficult at all to, in theory, technically, to create a system in which train travel was cheaper than flying, but we are a long way off that because frankly, because of the incredible lobbying power of the aviation industry and the fact that they are, you know, by definition they don't fit within national borders. So taxing things which don't fit within national borders is very difficult, which is why I think domestic flights are a really good way in. And France, as a result of a citizens' assembly in France, they've actually said that the French government has actually decided to have a ban on flights whether trains that get you there in 4 hours or less, and you can do much more within borders. I think it's, you know, absolutely within the gift of the UK government to do that, or to tax domestic flights and to put the money into, you know, good train services. There's also the problem of capacity of trains, as we know, but there's lots and lots that government could do.
Thank you. Paul?
I was just thinking, this kind of also got me thinking about the response post-COVID, and I think there was maybe from government a reaction to want to prop up and support airlines because they had a particularly difficult time during COVID. And I think within the school context as well, it was felt that COVID had it removed all of those sorts of opportunities of trips. And so lots of schools have come back in the last year or two and actually thought we need to almost double down on those and provide more of them because it was something that was missed. And so for many schools, they've really put a lot of effort into organising more trips than they would have done in the past in order to make up for those lost opportunities during COVID.
Thank you. Okay, so I don't think there's anyone else with a hand raised. And by the looks of it, there aren't any more questions, but someone has asked if we can save this chat just because it's quite a gauge and there's quite a lot of info.
Yeah, so the chat is automatically saved and I can send it as a file to everybody who's attended afterwards. I'll be sending a thank you email anyway afterwards, so look out for that.
Fab. Cool. So James, I read recently that in the US, the absence of good train coverage is because of lobbying by the airlines. There's a lot of comments more than questions. So I don't know if any of the panelists have questions for each other, possibly.
There's one question on there. Oh, sorry, Jonathan. Just to someone's asked about how to overcome the barriers of the time required to book overland travel, which is actually quite a good question because when we book a flight, it's one company, it's very straightforward, it's very easy. When we book overland travel, it's typically many different providers. So yeah, this person, Anya, currently trying to go to the south of France, but all the trains to come back are booked out. I don't know what other options are in France. So for those of you, Sandy, perhaps you went to the south of France, didn't you, from Edinburgh a couple of years ago? So do you want to give a bit of advice on that?
Yeah, and I think I know Anya. So hi, Anya. We go on a summer holiday down to the south of France because we're lucky enough to have my parents-in-law have a place there. And we go from Edinburgh all the way through, and you have to book with LNER, Eurostar, and SNCF, and so it can be quite tricky. We're in the process of booking our one for the summer coming up, and we've got halfway because it's too far in advance for us to book the SNCF ones. I mean, we will all know this, but the man in seat 61 is really helpful. I found the B Europe, so the Thalys or the SNCB Belgian website, really good for booking the Eurostar if you're booking it through your Interrail pass. And I've had bad experiences with Trainline in Europe because they say they booked it and then it just disappears. So it's all about kind of that time of organization and reset alarms for ourselves to go and book the tickets. But we have to do that for LNER a lot anyway, because we're often coming up and down from London as a family to see my in-laws who live down here. So that just has become part and parcel of our experience. When we went to Berlin, we didn't do it in enough time, so it meant that we had to go through Brussels on the way back and then through Paris on the way out. So there are ways around it, and the same is to be said with my trip to Amsterdam. I'm going out on a direct Eurostar to Amsterdam, and then on the way back I'm stopping off in Brussels. So it's a little bit of organisation. I haven't yet come to the bit where the trains are all fully booked, so I'm dreading that will happen one day. But generally it seems to be they're released 3 months in advance. So that's when we try and book them. Those would be my tips.
Cool, thank you. Does anyone else have any tips they'd like to share? We've just got a few minutes. Oh yeah, go on, Lois.
Yeah, I think something I was thinking about people were going to ask in this event, a bit about sort of vision. I feel like trains to Europe, say there's a lot of organisation know-how, like it can be quite a daunting thing, and I need to really have conversations about this for people. There's a lot of international people familiar with that it can sometimes be a confidence thing as well, and I think it's really important to recognize that confidence and the trips with lots of maybe a train is delayed, you might miss. I think that's it's really important to keep having the conversations with people to try and show that it's maybe even if it is hard than an airline's website and booking one transport.
Thank you. Okay, and then I think we've got time for just one more question. We've got this one. Based on different experiences, how can we influence the toxic travel policies of global development institutions? So I guess that's looking at bigger places.
I mean,
We've-
do you want me to come in on that? I mean,
Yeah,
I,
no,
I
absolutely.
I can't speak for those organisations, but one discussion we've been having at universities, which I think is relevant, is actually by developing better partnerships with universities in other countries, it actually really helps in terms of supporting universities in the global south, for example. So, you know, Lancaster Environment Centre has a particular expertise in coral reef conservation, which is brilliant, but there aren't a lot of coral reefs near Lancaster. So there are some coral reef scientists who are linking conversations about travel for research to conversations about how they can better collaborate with and offer opportunities for scientists based in the countries where the coral reefs are. So given that there's quite a push within universities to think through their commitments in terms of international responsibilities as well as climate, then those two things work together really well sometimes.
Cool, thank you. Okay, so I think that's the majority of questions. There are some new comments coming through now, but people I think are sharing resources. So I think unless anyone else has any more last words to share or any more questions, any more tips, any last things they want to say, I can see a hand raised by Jonathan there.
I was just going to say
yeah.
something that a lot of the discussions about, you know, how do you broach not wanting to fly at work? I suspect I'm the only self-employed person here. And so when I've had those conversations with me, it's tended to be with somebody that I've only got a short-term relationship. Perhaps it's a conference that's being organised or a book festival, and they will be paying for it. And that sort of awkwardness that people you talked about when you sometimes you were getting on with somebody. In one case, it was an American publisher that I was getting on really well with, talking about how we can promote the book, and they said, we'd like you to come over and just do a small bookshop tour. And I had to explain that I wouldn't be doing that, but what I wanted to, but I would be very, you know, amenable to doing a virtual bookshop tour. That sense that when you say I don't fly, because of that distancing, when you're self-employed, it can be absolutely crippling. I can think of 3 occasions where conversations have just absolutely shut down because they kind of think of you in that they see it as you accusing them of asking you to do something that is immoral. And I would love to find a way around that. I think the only answer is that more people need to be doing it, and they think, oh, okay, then we'll have to go to option B. But initially, you know, that there have definitely been occasions where what had seemed to be like what could be a long-term lasting relationship on a business bet level has just kind of stopped in its tracks because I've sort of, you know, outed myself as some sort of weirdo that doesn't want to fly. But that's very sort of localized to being self-employed and the nature of self-employed relationships, I suspect. Anyway, just thought I'd mention that in the sort of larger work context.
I think that's a really good point to make. I'll talk about being self-employed. So yeah, thank you very much for that, Jonathan. So I think if nobody else has anything else to add? I can't see any hands.
Paul just popped his hand up.
Okay.
The only thing is that leads on to then thinking that this is a group of people who have quite prominent positions and are looked upon in a very respected way. And I think there's a certain level of responsibility as well to lead in that sense. So Jonathan, what you're sort of saying is that you have principles, and that's one of your principles is that. And I think it's important that people feel reassured and confident to stand their ground in that sense. And actually that has a positive impact, a kind of ripple effect in that sense.
And now Sandy, go for it.
Go on.
No, sorry for talking to that same point, and that's something that I am very conscious of. I'm trying to lead the whole of emergency medicine into being more environmentally sustainable, and I think my position is made stronger by people knowing that I don't fly. It also takes that one little thing where people can get at you, be like, oh, but you flew to this conference, you can't be right, and they can use that as a way to kind of explain why they don't have to take any actions themselves. So I find it really makes me feel that I'm comfortable in what I'm doing, and it means that I'm a bit more of a leader because I'm saying, look, I don't do this is fine, this is the way we need to be going. So I think it's really helpful in that bit, kind of showing that you're doing, as well as telling people what to do.
Okay, lovely. Okay, so I think as it is 7:45, I think we'll start to draw this to a close. Remember, if you do have any questions that you think of afterwards, we will be posting this recording to our Facebook page, so you can leave a comment underneath, and we can pass on the questions to all our panelists. Yeah, and that'll be no problem. So yeah, really hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you so much for joining us. I think that was a really interesting conversation, and there's loads of different things to talk about further within that. I have also as well shared our guide to having climate conversations. It's more general, it's not specific to academia, but yeah, that is like a good resource to use to talk to people about these very difficult things. So yes, I think that's probably everything. And also, yes, all our events are free to attend, but if you would like to make a donation, please do. You can do so on our website, which is flightfree.co.uk. Obviously, it really helps us to do things like this and put more events together. So yes, thank you so much, and really hope you enjoyed it. And I'll say goodbye to everyone and hope to see you at the next event.